Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to give a little talk now. David asked me to do this, and Hugh. It's a bit of an odd situation for me. I'm actually a microbiologist, and you might say, what on earth is a microbiologist talking at an event like this? In fact, a few years ago, I saw that David gave his inaugural lecture, and I contacted him and said, "Oh, it's funny actually, we both, because we gave our inaugural lectures within a few weeks of each other, I said we both do the same kind of stuff at a certain level of abstraction." And David actually got what I was meaning straight away, and since then we kind of clicked on that, and we've had various meetings talking about these kind of issues, and it's been quite uplifting really to realise that there are connections between different kinds, what seems superficially to be entirely different kinds of scholarship, but underneath it there are deep connections there. So when we start talking about trees and trees of life, obviously this is a cultural metaphor, it's a biblical metaphor. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the tree of life obviously sits there very early on in the Bible. It occupies a role in the Kabbalistic tradition as well, as something very mystical. But of course, it's not just a Judeo-Christian thing. In Norse mythology, there's this Yggdrasil, this tree of life there that supports the universe and so forth. And it's obviously a clear archetype, the idea of a tree and life coming together. In the Christian tradition, of course, you have the tree of Jesse as an early example of kind of tree-like thinking, trying to sort of support this idea of genealogies, and obviously in the Christian tradition trying to establish that Jesus had this long pedigree that made sure that he was the right person to do the job that he was supposed to be doing. This kind of tree-like thinking of genealogies and family trees actually became quite pervasive in the Middle Ages. It's still with us today. Lots of people feel very, well, certainly when they get into middle or old age, feel very happy to understand their genealogy, understand their family trees and look back, and it gives them a sense of rootedness. Obviously in the sense of the tree of Jesse, also it's not just talking about the past and where people have come from, but it talks about the predestination of where they should be. Even in things like Lord of the Rings, there's this idea of, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and the idea that who people are and where they belong and what they will be depends on all of that looking back. But of course, trees also entered academic thinking in the early part and the middle part of the 19th century. You've got here Karl Lachmann, founder of the field of stematics, coming along with his ideas about how you should look at manuscripts and the relationship between them, and saying that in fact if this is a genealogical relationship you can draw trees. Kind of interesting, slightly subversive that he did this with Lucretius, which is also one of those kind of manuscripts, the traditions from antiquity that disquiets Christians so much, because he was the first kind of Richard Dawkins, wasn't he? Lucretius, coming up with all that stuff, just atoms colliding and all that stuff. But and then in the middle there you've got August Schleicher, who came up with the idea that actually languages were kind of related in a family tree kind of way. He called it Stammbaumtheorie. He actually came up with that idea in the middle part of the 19th century, around about the same time that Darwin was coming up with his idea about family trees of life. And in fact there was some lively banter, I think, between them, that Schleicher was like, this Darwin guy's kind of copying me. And Darwin actually does mention in the Origin of Species that the evolutionary relationships between living organisms is a bit like the relationships between languages, and yet there was a whole section on that. So it's kind of interesting that these three ideas all sort of emerged around the same kind of time. Here's one of Schleicher. This is from my book, actually, The Rough Guide to Evolution. This is a figure we drew where we translated Schleicher into English from German and just capitulated the divisions that he sketched out when he looked at language groups and this kind of idea of a tree. I couldn't find anything from Lachmann in terms of stemma. This is, what's his name, Swedish guy, Schlichter, who did early stematics, but even before Lachmann, looking at different manuscript editions, I think, among Swedish legal documents. But of course, as a biologist, I'm going to come in and tell you about Darwin. Actually, I forgot to say that I have to put in the caveat that I know that the history of ideas, the history of the world, is not just the history of great men, and it's not just about these individuals. There were lots of people before Darwin who had ideas about trees in biology. There were people who thought about relationships between languages before Schleicher and so forth. But we have to simplify, because otherwise we'd be here for an hour, 2 hours, if we went through everything. Darwin actually holds a special place, though, in biologists' hearts, if you like, because he really was the first person to breathe life into this idea of the tree of life. And he went off around the world in the Beagle, and then he came back to London. And in those years in London, he started writing in a series of notebooks. And one of the remarkable things is we can see Darwin's thinking maturing because we actually have these notebooks and we can read them and we can see what he was thinking at certain times. And if you go through a particular notebook, Notebook B, you see this little note here saying the tree of life should be perhaps called the coral of life, bases of branches dead so that passages cannot be seen. He was grappling with the idea that there was extinction and that many organisms have existed that no longer exist. And in fact, maybe the organisms that no longer exist outnumber the ones that we currently see around us. And he sketched this. This was the first drawing he ever did of anything that looked like an evolutionary tree in one of his notebooks. And he puts this kind of dotted lines in here to suggest these are the things that are extinct that we no longer can see and know about. They're the ancestors of the things shown in solid lines that we know about. And he came up with just a little, on this, I think the same page or the next page, he came up with another figure showing a similar kind of thing, but a lot bushier. The idea that there was lots of different varieties all coming out of a common ancestor quite recently. And this actually, in the evolution of evolutionary thinking in life, was something quite new and interesting, because he realised that there was this kind of bushiness and branchiness of life. It wasn't that there was a kind of some ladder of perfection, a scala naturae, inevitably leading to better and better things with a kind of predestination as to where you were going. It was just, things branching out and then branching out again and branching out again. But most of you, I'm sure, probably come across at some stage the most iconic picture that Darwin drew, which was a few pages later in his notebook, which I called this iconic Cogito. I'm probably one of the few people can remember when we used to have Cogito ergo sum in the station here. I actually wrote to the company and said, where has this bloody thing gone from Descartes? Why has it been taken away? And it's still sitting somewhere in some warehouse, so we should bring it back. But anyway, that's a different Cogito. This is Darwin's Cogito, where he says, I think, and then he draws this little sketch of this kind of busy branching, where you have an ancestor and then it branches off, and then you've got one branch has got this many branches on, another branch going off in a different direction. And this is the first inklings, really, of that idea that he has of branching evolution with all its complexities. In fact, this has become so iconic in biology. There's a guy called Carl Zimmer who's written a book about tattoos in science. So you people in the humanities, you might think you're odd, but some scientists are so odd that they actually engrave these kind of images on their own bodies. So here's a guy who's had that actually put on as a tattoo on his body. He felt it was so important in life. In fact, if you fast forward a couple of decades, I mean, there's all this story about Darwin took a long time to get round to actually writing about his evolutionary ideas. He kept them to himself, and you can argue why he did that. But the one thing that stands out is that when he actually did write The Origin of Species, the only figure he had in The Origin of Species was this one here, which was of a phylogenetic tree. It's the contrast not perhaps working out as well as it should. It looks better on my screen than it does here, but you can see it's basically a series of bifurcations here, branching points, and he's making the point again. This is how he sees evolution progressing among living organisms. And in fact, in The Origin of Species, a lot of it is kind of, he waffles on, but occasionally he reaches these heights of rhetoric, which are actually quite remarkable. And here's what he says about the tree of life. He said the affinities of all beings of the same class have sometimes been represented by a great tree. I believe this simile largely speaks the truth. As buds give rise by growth to fresh buds, and these, if vigorous, branch out and overtop on all sides many a feebler branch, so by generation I believe it has been with the great tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth, and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications. If people say scientists can't write, well, many scientists can't write, but occasionally there are scientists who can actually get a bit of rhetoric in there that sounds quite good. Darwin didn't actually spend much of his time drawing trees. One of his disciples, this guy Ernst Haeckel, did spend a lot of time drawing trees and came up with these very ornate trees depicting the evolution of life and the branching patterns of life, and really hammering home the metaphor of a tree of gnarled oak and all this kind of stuff. There's actually a story that Haeckel met Darwin, went to see him in Down House, and it must have been a rather strange encounter because Haeckel didn't speak a word of English and Darwin didn't speak a word of German. I think they just nodded and smiled at each other over a cup of tea, but there we go. Okay, that's trees. What about words? Well, you can say that living organisms, we have these trees, evolutionary trees, and it's similar to manuscripts, similar to language. But in the last 50 years or so, actually things have become much more dramatically similar. And this starts really with this paper in the early 1960s by Zuckerkandl and Pauling. Pauling went on to win the Nobel Prize, where they said actually all these DNA sequences and protein sequences that we're starting to realise are out there, we can use those as manuscripts of evolutionary history, because we can look at changes that happen in those between different organisms, and we can kind of infer that there must be a kind of clock ticking away, that over time, a certain amount of time, a certain number of changes occur, and that things that are more closely related will be more similar in their sequences and things that are more distantly related. And this really set up this whole new discipline of molecular phylogenetics. And in a way, this actually provided a completely independent verification of Darwin's view of all life has common ancestry and all different groups have common ancestry, and something completely unknown to Darwin, but in the end ended up verifying and validating much of what he'd said. And so, in a sense, this, we're now at that stage where we can draw kind of quite deep similarities between different disciplines, studies of languages. So the idea that you can take all the current Indo-European languages and you can work back and infer what Proto-Indo-European might have looked like. In my discipline, we can take a particular protein which is found in all living organisms, and we can look at the sequence underlying it, and we can say, that sequence must have been there in the ancestor of all living organisms. And of course, in your discipline, you're trying to force your way back to what did those original autographs that Luke actually wrote himself, or John in this case actually wrote himself, look like, and how to reconcile those different variants that we see before us and work out what the original was. And obviously part of this involves similar kinds of ideas of aligning things and working out what is the same in that thing to that thing, and therefore how can we can infer what's changed. So here's a crude attempt looking at, obviously God didn't write in English, nor did St. Paul, but I've just borrowed this, these are a few things that I could lay my hands on easily about the different English translations of the Bible and how you can see both language changing and in some ways manuscripts changing. Here below is an alignment of biological sequences. So biological sequences are written in two different kinds of alphabet. Proteins are written in an alphabet of 20 characters. DNA is written in an alphabet of 4 characters. But you have the same issue of you have to try and align these things and work out, is that position there the same as that one there? Is it the same thing but in a different example? And therefore, can we infer that they actually had a common ancestry at that particular position and so forth? All these issues are very similar. Here's an illustration of family trees, modern kind of thinking about Indo-European family trees. It's not very scholarly. It actually appeared in Nature, but it's kind of rather florid in its way. But it goes way beyond what Schleicher thought of and extends that. And of course, in the field of language, there are those who would wish to go beyond even Proto-Indo-European and try and join everything together. Whether there was this mother tongue or proto-world, as people call it, that is still an interesting question. And there are those, I guess in your discipline we have the same. You have lumpers and splitters. There are those people who want to make everything look like that's quite different from that, and those, well, they're effectively the same, and the same arguments are playing out here. Here's a recent paper that came out looking at using these kind of approaches to look at Indo-European, using kind of phylogenetic sequence-based approaches that borrowed from sort of biological sequence analysis to work out when when was the ancestor of all current Indo-European languages, and where was that population that spoke that language likely to live? And they favour this idea in this paper that it was there in Anatolia that the first Indo-European speakers came from. But they kind of go back and they try and calibrate each of these different branch points as to when different language groups diverged and work their way back. Now, as I said before, I think there are many commonalities across scholarship that transcend the idea of arts, humanities, sciences. And this is one that I quite like from Alfred North Whitehead, who was a philosopher. And he came up with this idea that the guiding motto in life of every natural philosopher, by which he meant scientist, he was just at that time when they hadn't quite got used to calling him scientists, but it actually probably applies to every academic, is that you should seek simplicity and then distrust it. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a very good dictum, actually. It's a very good motto. And from your own field, I know you have your own kind of mottos, mm-hmm. rules of thumb that you apply. They're not absolutes, but they kind of help thinking in this kind of way. So if we compare languages, life, manuscripts, there are many features. I'm using biological nomenclature, but it kind of means the same thing when you apply it in other contexts. You get changes in the individual characters, you get bits of stuff moving around, being rearranged, you get stuff dropping out, you get stuff being shoved in. One of the problems you get, though, and we'll come on to that in a minute, is you get this idea of lateral transfer. Things actually, we like this idea of family trees and branches and everything being tidy, but sometimes things jump across when they shouldn't, as we think. I mean, they do jump across, whether they should or not, that's a value judgment. There are lots of problems as well. How do you do alignments so that you say that's the same as that's the same as that? If you're doing two things pairwise, that's fairly easy. But if you've got dozens or hundreds or thousands, then it becomes much more of a kind of difficult, more intractable problem. Working out the polarity of change. So is that thing a deletion there? Is it been taken out of that set of things, or has it actually been inserted into that lineage there? In biology, we use the term indel for insertion stroke deletion, so that we we accept we're agnostic about the direction of change. I don't know whether that's insertion or deletion, but it's a change. That's one or the other. Similar kind of things, you know, inserted material, does it look different from everything else that's around it? So you can see it's clearly different or not. Tree drawing, how do you draw trees? You know, what algorithms do you use? What assumptions do you put into your algorithms and so forth? And obviously, clearly there are problems in dealing with large data sets, visualizing relationships between things, storing that information. Okay, let's be a bit more fanciful, talk about from Luke to Luca. So who's Luca? Well, Luca is what we call in biology the last universal common ancestor. So that's the last ancestor that all life has. If we look at Luca, if you look at Luke, you've got your problems. You know, what about those three synoptic gospels? How do they evolve since the earliest autographs? Yeah, we use stematics and various things, cladistics and so forth. But then, what about before then? Well, then you've got your synoptic problem. What about before then? Well, then you've got this other issue. We have similar kind of things. I'll go into more detail in the subsequent slides. We can, if I want to work out whether I'm related to a duck-billed platypus and then to that plant over there, that's a plastic plant, it's not a real plant. If there were a real plant, then, you know, how do we do it? Well, we do it through molecular phylogenetics. But then there's this issue when we really grind down right to the last common ancestor. What are the relationships between the earliest branches and that, and what kind of thing was it? And then can we go back beyond that? What can we see beyond that kind of event horizon, if you like? We'll start with the biology. I mean, Luca, the last universal common ancestor. We know that there are many commonalities in all life forms. They have the same genetic code. So if you want to, if you go to a supermarket and you buy vegetarian cheese, and it will say there's no vegetarian, you think, hang on, where's the rennet come from? Well, the rennet's been produced because they've cloned an enzyme into E. coli, a bacterium, and used the bacterium. The fact you can take an enzyme from an animal, from a sheep, and clone it into E. coli is remarkable evidence of the fact that there is so much commonality in life. We have the same kind of genetic code, the same kind of apparatus for making proteins and doing things, and that is considered as strong evidence that all life does come from one common ancestor. There's a guy called Carl Woese who actually died just a few weeks ago, who back in the 1960s and 70s made us realise that actually, if we look at the big structure of life, we have this trichotomy of three different kinds of organisms. So we have people like us, and plants, and animals, and all sorts as eukaryotes. We have bacteria, but he discovered there was this whole third domain of life called the archaea, which are very unusual unicellular, well, not unusual now, we recognise they're pretty usual, but at the time they were thought to be an unusual group of single-cell organisms. And when you basically draw this iconic tree of these three branches, and then here we have the last universal common ancestor. And the assumption was, well, it must have been a pretty basic kind of thing, a simple kind of organism, similar to modern bacteria or something like that. But there are problems with that view. This is actually a box from Nature, a scientific journal, where they kind of make the point that actually you can get transfers of information from one lineage to another, and that upsets your simple view of simple divergences. And so one key point is that the bacterial lineage actually donated a whole load of genes to the eukaryotic lineage, and there's in fact an organelle called the mitochondrion, which lives in all of us, in all of our cells, but is actually a descendant of bacteria. And it's a bacterium that entered a eukaryote and started living inside a eukaryotic cell as a kind of squatter, and then eventually became so absorbed into that cell that it became effectively part of it. But we can clearly see from all the sequences and so forth that there's been this transfer. And in this paper they made this is a bit like the fact that French after the Norman conquest, donated all these words into English. So the words for beef and pork and mutton have come from French. And same arguments in manuscript traditions, where someone copies from one manuscript tradition over here that they're not supposed to know about into a tradition over here and move stuff across, and that simple branching patterns don't apply. So those horizontal transfers, this is from my book, the Rough Guide. Basically, this is the view we now have, is that actually there was this huge transfer of horizontal transfer of genes here for the mitochondria at the base of the eukaryotes. Another interesting transfer is that chloroplasts, which underlie all of the plants that you see around you and responsible for photosynthesis, they're actually bacteria which did the same thing. They moved across into a different lineage. So we kind of recognise all that. The other thing we recognise, though, is that actually it's not a safe assumption to assume there was one simple cell that was Luca, this last universal common ancestor. And in fact, there may have been a whole community of cells. May not have been one genome, there might have been lots of different genomes. And they were kind of anarchic and multiple, and who knows what was going on, how many of them sharing genes and what was going on. And I guess the same arguments apply in manuscript traditions. The idea that there was St. Luke one Friday afternoon said, that's it, finished, and wrote it, put it in a box, and then someone copied it, and then someone copied it. Maybe he wrote 20 different manuscripts at different times of his life, gave one to his girlfriend and one to his parents. Who knows how it happened. His mother-in-law, exactly. Yeah. The other interesting question is, what about if you push this? Okay, we talk about evolution as we compare this sequence with this sequence and say they look so similar, they must have a common ancestor. But could you go back beyond Luca? Well, you can. So this is what we call the genetic code in biology. This is the way in which this alphabet that we see in DNA, where you have three characters in DNA, get translated into single characters in proteins. So you have this triplet code. DNA gets turned into 20 different amino acids plus some stop codons in. When we look at that, we can see that there's not randomness there. In fact, the enzymes that couple the codons to the amino acids fall into two large families, and there's a sort of chicken and egg. How can you have those proteins involved in doing this predating the way in which you make proteins? And we can sort of start to look back beyond Luca and say, well, there must have been a simpler organism than Luca that maybe had fewer amino acids, that actually did things in a different way, a simpler way, and you can start to look back. Now, okay, I'm starting to get a little bit too biological for you. Just one last point is that when we look at the thing, there are two things that couple DNA to protein. One is that genetic code. The other one is this organelle, the ribosome. And when people started looking carefully at the ribosome, they realised that the ribosome actually, although it's mostly made of protein, which we're familiar with as a kind of can-do molecule for biology, actually RNA, a different kind of nucleic acid from DNA, subtly different, related but not quite the same, actually sat at the heart of that and was actually involved in the function of it. And people now say this is a remnant of an old world, RNA world, where RNA was the actual language of life, and that DNA and proteins hadn't yet come to the fore. Okay, so let's look at trichotomies again. We've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, wouldn't it be nice and easy if we could just draw a simple cladogram like this and say, okay, well, Mark came first, a bit of divergence, then Matthew came off, and then Luke. I don't know if you took all the common material that's in the three different Gospels and actually scored it up and drew a cladogram, whether it would look quite as clean as this. But we know that real life is a lot more messy. Alfred North Whitehead would tell us so. And we've got this complex relationship between the different Gospels, and it's clear that there must have been transfer from different sources. There's not a clear branching relationship here. It's much more difficult than that. Before this audience, I wouldn't have a clue as to whether you still accept these ideas about Q. I know it's all controversial, and that half of people I think probably most people don't accept it quite so straightforwardly. But nonetheless, it's not a clean picture. And we have the same issues in biology. What about going back beyond that original document, the manuscript that Luke wrote? Well, he wrote in Greek, but Jesus spoke Aramaic. If you look for remnants of that Aramaic world, you find them. They're in the Gospels there. Occasional bits where they can't help themselves and they just speak in Aramaic and it gets transcribed into Greek, and there we are. But what about going back to try and look at what Jesus said in the language he spoke? And my reading, again, I'm speaking for experts, I know nothing, is that my understanding is that people have tried this quite a lot, and it seemed to be in fashion for a while, but now seems to be pretty much out of fashion. But there are nonetheless a few examples, and here's one example that I came across where there's these particular readings between Luke and Matthew that actually kind of make a lot of sense if you translate them back into Aramaic and then look for a little typo in the original Aramaic. I don't know whether that's still believed by modern scholars or not. But actually this brings us on to another issue, which is that in all these disciplines where you're looking at history and the way things change, sometimes they change in ways that mean that what you look at now doesn't make sense. You can only make sense of it by looking at the historical backdrop to what you're looking at. A famous evolutionary biologist, Ernst Mayr, made this point here. He said most scientific problems, most problems to do with anything to do with history and phylogenies and so are far better understood by studying their history than their logic. And this is one particular example that we have in biology, which is always wheeled out, which is the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which is that there is a nerve which comes from the brain and goes to the larynx here, but instead of just going from the brain to the larynx, it dives all the way down into the thorax. It goes round an artery, loops round an artery, and then comes all the way back up again. Now, in me, you could argue, well, it's gone a few inches out of its way. What's the big deal? But in the giraffe, it goes meters, I think 10 or 15 meters out of its way. It goes all the way down here and then comes back up again. If you look at the evolution of vertebrates, you can see why that's happened. If you look in a fish, basically, there is no neck, long neck like that. The nerve just happens to loop around the artery and just finds its way across quickly. But in evolutionary terms, it's kind of got caught in that knot, and evolution doesn't have a way of unpicking it, and you end up with this kind of result. So I think in both fields, you can't just look at what's in front of you and make sense of it. You have to look at history and think about it. I'm almost at the last slide now. So another interesting theme that's emerged in recent years, and I was speaking to David over dinner about the idea of open access as a common theme in scholarship. Another common theme, though, is harnessing the wisdom of the crowd. So in the past, the idea was that the scholar was so important and knew everything, and was the only person that could really make any contribution. You have to really learn your stuff and for years or decades, and then you could say something about the world. But we're actually realising that actually if you throw problems open to the world, and with the internet, obviously you can throw a problem open to a huge audience out there and say, oh yeah, what do you people think of this? You actually get something useful out of it. So I was involved a couple of years ago in a project where we looked at the E. coli genome from the E. coli outbreak that was happening in Germany, and we were involved in actually analysing the genome, but we didn't just keep it to ourselves. We threw the results out onto a website and then said to the rest of the world, what do you people make of this? And people from all over the world, from America, from Asia, from Australia, all joined in, and together we actually created something that was the sum was much greater, something that was much greater than the sum of its parts, if you like. And I've noticed that I've come across this website here, Ancient Lives, where they're actually calling on people, just anyone around the world, go in there, get an account, they can go to the Oxyrhynchus manuscripts, and they can look at that and say, that's a bit of Greek there, I think that's an alpha, I think that's a delta, or whatever. You don't have to know the Greek alphabet very well. But what they're doing is they're relying on the fact that humans are much better at actually seeing those patterns that any computer, any optical character recognition software would not cope anywhere near so well, because these manuscripts of, there's problems of contrast and degraded and all that kind of stuff. And even getting someone who knows nothing about the field is better than trying to do it through computers. And if you relied on the experts, well, there's so few experts who actually can read that and say, oh, that's a text from Menander, or that's the Gospel of Thomas. How many people are there who could do that? There's only dozens or hundreds at most in the world. But this is something that, I don't know how many they actually got doing it, but I would imagine it's probably thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of people that can log on there and do this stuff. Anyway, that's me finished. I'm going to finish with a final quote from The Origin of Species. Now, I had an aspiration, but I have not met my aspiration, which was to give you this quote in New Testament Greek, in Koine. I haven't been able to do that. I've only been able to find it in modern Greek. And if any of you want to take away practical, you can take this away and you can turn that into New Testament Greek. But this is what Darwin said at the end of The Origin of Species. And I think it's an inspiring quote generally. And those of you who are still awake might notice there's actually a Pentateuchal allusion in there as well. So what he said was, there is grandeur in this view of life, with several powers having been breathed originally into a few forms or into one. But whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. That's me finished.